Thank you. Now, it's great to be here, and I've been told the schedule changed a little bit, so I have a little more time. So I'll begin with one of my favorite stories, dedicated to my father. My dad was an exterminator, never liked his business, not very successful. He had a small little exterminating business, and he really hated his job. But when he was 72, he retired, and my brother, who was the financially successful Schumer, bought them a little house in Florida. And they go down from New York every winter. And they've had a great time there, but as the years have gone on, my dad's 90 now, my mom's 85. Praise God. You know, they have a little less to do. They can't play golf anymore. Many of their friends are gone. So for those of you from Florida, know that all senior citizens are allowed to enroll for free in courses at Florida Atlantic University. And so my mom and dad enrolled in a course called Humor. Now, what is the course called Humor? Every Thursday at 4 o'clock, they drive over to Florida Atlantic University, and here in the course called Humor, every week, an erstwhile comedian from the Catskills, who never made it in the Catskills, gets up and tells jokes for 45 minutes. It's a different comedian every week. My dad never went to college. He said, gee, college is pretty easy. I should have gone. Anyway, they call me with their favorite joke each week, so here's one of them. Mrs. Goldfarb is brought before the judge. And the judge says, Mrs. Goldfarb, you're back. Yes, Your Honor, I'm back. And Mrs. Goldfarb, he's very exasperated, the judge is. What did you steal this time? This time, and she said, I stole a can of peaches from the public supermarket down the road. And the judge is clearly fed up, and he says, Mrs. Goldfarb, look, I know you're a kleptomaniac, and I know that this is an illness. I know you can easily afford a can of peaches, but this is the 17th time you've been brought before me for shoplifting this year, and it's only March. I have no choice. I have to sentence you to some time in jail. Now, how many peaches were in the can? Mrs. Goldfarb says, Your Honor, there were 4 peaches in the can. Then I have no choice to sentence you to 4 nights in prison, 1 for each peach. And he's about to bang the gavel and pronounce sentence when a gentleman in the middle of the courtroom gets up all excited and agitated. Your Honor, he says, may it please the court. I'm her husband. She also stole a can of peas. So, when you retire from whatever part of the country you are, when you go to Florida, enroll in Florida Atlantic University and join the course called Humor. Anyway, it's great to be here today. As the snow comes down in Washington, some of you might have asked, why has God chosen today, the day of the AIPAC conference, when so many important things need to be discussed and strategized, to cover Washington, D.C. in snow? Well, I'm reminded of the passage in the book of Job, where God asked Job, have you entered into the treasures of the snow? Basically, God was saying to Job, you, my friend, do not know very much. You must humble yourself and not accuse God of doing things without a wise purpose. Well, I have a theory as to why God picked today to bless us with such plentiful snow. I believe it is to send a message to the Congress, to the country, and to the entire world that the snow might shut down the roads. It might shut down the government, but it will never shut down the voices of those who fight for the security of the State of Israel. Not to mention the ancillary benefit that all of you are trapped here and have nowhere to go during this speech. Anyway, it's an honor to be here today at the AIPAC 2014 Policy Conference. Before I get started, I want to let you know that you have the best delegation of representatives of anyone I've ever worked with. To Michael Kassin and Bob Cohn and Howard Kaur, Esther Kurtz, and the whole AIPAC team, thank you for everything you do. For AIPAC, for America, for Israel, and for the entire global community. Now, I speak to you today at a moment of great importance for all of us here in this room and for Jews across the world. Israel, throughout its young history, has faced challenges, any one of which most nations do not ever have to confront. 3 major wars, numerous smaller ones, 2 Palestinian uprisings, waves of terror, rocket attacks against innocent civilians, economic and diplomatic boycotts. Yet despite all of this, Israel's role in the world has never been more prominent or more necessary than it is today. Economically, the innovation and entrepreneurial activity in high-tech and clean energy that is happening throughout Israel is something to behold and to truly be proud of. Her economy is outperforming most other countries. Financial, high-tech, and biopharmaceutical companies all feel that Tel Aviv is a must-have address. Militarily, Israel's near-term security situation is relatively good. States which have posed conventional threats to Israel, like Syria and Iraq, are not in a position to challenge Israel with conventional forces. Hamas is at a low ebb, facing Egyptian hostility and internal struggles. America continues to help train the Palestinian Authority to fight terror in the West Bank, and terrorist incidents, particularly in the West Bank, at a much lower rate than they have been in a long time. Culturally, Israeli films, actors, television shows, celebrities, and music have become popular from all around the world. And as a haven for persecuted Jews wherever they may be, Israel is now beginning to see a marked increase in European Jews seeking protection under Israel's shield due to a disturbing trend of rising anti-Semitism throughout the continent. But at the same time, as all these good things are happening, Israel's place in the world has, at the same time that Israel's place in the world has reached historic highs, the threats to Israel's existence are also continuing to intensify. It's hard to look at the future without deep, deep concern. Instability and uncertainty prevail, whether in Egypt or Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, or Jordan. No one can confidently predict what these nations will look like in a year or 2 or 5, but we all know the trend lines are not encouraging. Radical Islamists are gaining power and a foothold in the Sinai, in Gaza, on the Syrian side of the Golan, and in Lebanon. Hamas, Hezbollah, and Syria have close to 170,000 rockets and missiles aimed at Israeli population centers. Israeli military planners now have to be ready to meet every imaginable threat, conventional and unconventional, symmetric and asymmetric, from every single one of its borders. And looming over all of this today are the 2 most grave threats to Israel's continued existence, and I will address both. The first, the threat posed by an Islamic Republic of Iran who is determined to acquire nuclear weapons capability. And second, a sustained campaign of delegitimization and boycotts, led by many who seek only to discredit the Jewish state of Israel and not achieve any constructive solution. Before I discuss each of these grave threats in more detail, I want to make a clear statement to everyone in the world who is watching today and monitoring the difficulties of this moment. Israel is a remarkable and resilient nation that can and will successfully overcome any obstacles and challenges its enemies might seek to place before it. But at this critical time, we cannot and must not allow Israel to face these critical challenges alone. Make no mistake, until my last day on this earth, I will fight with every fiber of my being to make sure that the relationship between the United States and Israel is the strongest it can possibly be. And I promise you, today, together, we will never allow anything to break the everlasting bond between America and Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. Now on Iran, one must begin by recognizing America and Israel share the same goal, and that goal is to live in a world where it is impossible for Iran to develop nuclear weapons. It cannot be said enough that the reason for this goal is not just to protect Israel. It's also to protect the security of the United States, the security of the Middle East, and the security of our energy supply. That's why I co-sponsored legislation, as Bob mentioned in December, along with my colleagues, that would expand sanctions imposed against Iran. The Nuclear Weapon-Free Iran Act says that if Iran fails to come to an agreement after 6 months, sanctions will be increased. The bottom line is very simple. It is sanctions, tough sanctions, not the goodness of the heart or a change in heart of the Iranian leaders that brought Iran to the table. In this regard, President Obama and his administration deserve enormous recognition and thanks. Whatever you think of President Obama on other issues, it cannot be disputed that he worked vigorously, painstakingly, and effectively to line up the many nations behind the sanctions regime. Not only the P5+1, and it was hard enough to get China and Russia on board, but also other nations, such as South Korea and India, nations that wanted to buy Iranian oil, but agreed not to do so for the good of the effort. But just because tough sanctions are the very thing that brought Iran to the table, we must keep tough sanctions in place until Iran agrees to give up nuclear weapons. The only way that Iran will voluntarily give up nuclear weapons is if they know that tougher and tougher sanctions will be put in place until they do. Already, ruling mullahs are under severe pressure. The Iranian regime is more isolated than it's ever been. Sanctions against Iran have worked and will continue to work as long as we remain steadfast. For our friends and our family, our mishpucha in Israel, and for our own national security, I know we will. It is no secret that I believe that we should not, in the interim agreement, have reduced sanctions in any way until Iran reduced its nuclear capability. Many of us believe that any reduction in sanctions relieves the psychological pressure of future sanctions and gives Iran the hope that it will be able to both maintain nuclear weapons capability and get tough sanctions off their back. But now, we are in a period where the new negotiations toward a final agreement have begun. One cannot predict the future, but I can assure you of two things. First, the Congress will be heavily involved in monitoring whether this recent diminution of sanctions from the interim agreement is having an effect on the Iranian economy such that Iran becomes emboldened not to negotiate in good faith. And we will be monitoring whether the core sanction regime remains in place. Secondly, Congress will make sure that any final agreement reached with Iran must accomplish the goal of permanently preventing Iran from ever having nuclear weapons. Iran's leaders must understand that we do not have a policy of containment. Our policy is to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon in the first place. We will not allow a nuclear Iran. I want to conclude my comments on Iran with some very clear statements of where we must go from here. If companies or countries violate the current sanctions regime, each and every one must be sanctioned harshly and quickly. If Iran violates the terms of the Joint Plan of Action, those sanctions that have been lifted as a result of the agreement must be quickly and immediately reimposed. Unless Iran signs a final agreement that prevents it from building, developing, or acquiring nuclear weapons, Congress must impose a series of tougher sanctions against Iran, including limiting the export of Iranian oil. Congress has a duty to define whether a final agreement is acceptable to secure a lasting resolution of the issue, and if the final agreement with Iran does not, in fact, lead to the dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program, Congress will not agree to the diminution of the current sanctions regime. Instead, just the contrary. We will pass new laws and tough sanctions should the negotiations fail. Finally, and most significantly, of course, we all want the negotiations to succeed. But if negotiations fail to secure the goal of an Iran that is not capable of making nuclear weapons, the United States must be prepared to use all available tools to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear weapon state, because it is vital to Israel's security, but even more importantly, it is vital to America's security. No nuclear Iran, one way or the other. Now, while a nuclear Iran poses the most immediate threat to Israel, we must not lose sight of an equally dangerous threat to Israel's long-term existence. That is the effort to delegitimize Israel through boycotts sought to be imposed solely on Israel and not on any other nation. The leaders of these boycotts claim they're criticizing Israel in order to achieve a resolution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Well, it is very suspicious that those who promote boycotting Israel do not seek boycotts against any other nations in the world, particularly those nations in the Middle East whose human rights records include hanging dissenters from cranes in city squares, imprisoning and torturing critics of the government. Now, I want to tell you something. There is a word that has been used throughout history when Jewish people are judged by one measure and standard and the rest by another. The word has been used to describe the mistreatment of Jewish people throughout the centuries, when everyone else was allowed to farm and the Jew could not, when everyone else was allowed to live where they wanted in Moscow or somewhere else, and the Jew could not, when others could become academics or tradesmen, and the Jews could not. The word that describes all of these acts is a very simple one: anti-Semitism. I believe that those who call for boycotts of Israel without calling for boycotts of other neighboring nations whose human rights records are in fact reprehensible, are practicing, whether they know it or not, whether they admit it or not, a modern form of what we call anti-Semitism. You can't say it's okay for everybody else, but not okay for the Jews. You can't say it's okay for every other nation, but not for the Jewish nation. And we rely on you, right here, to make that argument strongly. We need to make our voices loud and clear and make sure that the delegitimizers are themselves delegitimized. These calls for delegitimizing Israel through boycotts may not pose an immediate security threat to Israel, but they will pose a long-term threat if we allow our voices to be quiet. If we shrug our shoulders and say this doesn't really matter, it does. We will succeed if we strongly and constantly oppose those who call for boycotts of Israel and expose their double standard. That is why, when you talk to your members of Congress, you should be calling on legislators to actively, openly, and vociferously oppose any effort to boycott Israel. And one further thought on these boycotts. Those who, even with the best of intentions, warn Israel that she must make agreements she feels unjust because the boycotting will only get worse in the future, those people have it all wrong. Instead of saying that those boycotts might succeed in pressuring Israel, which only encourages the boycotters, those quote-unquote friends should be condemning the boycotts in every possible way, weakening them. These boycott efforts are not only unjust and immoral, they are also counterproductive in achieving a truly lasting and enduring peace between Israel and the Palestinians. The only way to achieve peace is for everyone to understand that first and foremost, Palestinians must accept that there can be no peace unless and until they recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. Even though 85% of Israelis believe that there should be a nation state for the Palestinian people, a main reason we do not have peace yet is because too many Palestinians do not reciprocally believe that a Jewish nation state of Israel should exist. And a truly lasting peace can only exist if there are no more claims to the land of the Jewish state of Israel. So here is the view of too many Palestinians. They feel the Europeans treated the Jewish people very badly, far worse than many Jews were treated in Arab-speaking nations, ultimately culminating in the horror of the Holocaust. They believe, in compensation for that brutality, the Europeans gave the Jews, quote, our land, as penance for what they had done to the Jewish people. Now, we would say Israel's been the spiritual homeland of the Jewish people for over 3,000 years. Read the Torah, read the Bible. But the Palestinians obviously do not believe in our Torah. And when Palestinians insist on a so-called right of return, where anyone can claim land in Israel, they are saying they want 2 Palestinian states and no Jewish states in the Middle East. Because under the terms of the right of return, the number of Palestinians allowed to return to Israel would overwhelm the number of Jewish Israelis. As Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, without Palestinian recognition of Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people, the conflict cannot end, because Palestinians will be continuing to make claims on the land of the Jewish nation-state of Israel even after a Palestinian state is created. And as President Obama clearly stated in his State of the Union speech, there needs to be Palestinian recognition of a Jewish state of Israel if there's going to be an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now some say, oh, it's the settlements that are the issue. I would point out to them what happened in Gaza. Israel voluntarily ended settlements in Gaza. You may remember the pictures of Israeli soldiers dragging the settlers unwillingly out of Netzarim and other settlements. Israel withdrew on its own. What was the Palestinian response after Israel withdrew? Rockets sent into Sderot and other places in pre-1967 Israel. It cannot be that settlements are the reason we don't have peace in the Middle East, whatever your view is on the settlements. To those who say the obstacle of peace is defining the borders of the 2 states, if only Israel would go back to the 1967 borders, we could have peace. I would point to them the negotiations in 2000, where Ehud Barak was willing to agree to the 1967 borders, and it cost him his election as prime minister. It was Yasser Arafat and the Palestinians who rejected this settlement. No, it is not where the border should be that stands in the way of peace. Peace negotiations will be difficult. They will be arduous. But we all must make sure that Israel is not pressured to give up its security in exchange for an illusory peace. Secretary Kerry, who you'll hear from soon, has been dogged in pursuit of an agreement between the 2 parties and has conducted negotiations up to now the way they should be conducted, quietly, behind the scenes, working closely with Israel and the Palestinians, and stressing the importance of Israel's security requirements. So I say to the Palestinian leadership, negotiations are the only way you will realize your own state. Just as war and terrorism have not given you a state, the United Nations cannot give you a state, boycotting Israel cannot give you a state, getting companies to divest from Israel cannot and will not give you a state. You, the Palestinian leadership, need to sit down with the Prime Minister of Israel, who has said he will meet with you anywhere, anytime, and engage seriously in the give and take of negotiations. And you must educate your people not to hate Israelis and honor terrorists, but to understand that coexistence with Israel is the best way to bring peace, prosperity, and well-being that the Palestinian people want and deserve. So tonight, in conclusion, my friends from all around the country, 17,000 strong, and because of the snow, all of you are here. You have my pledge. I will do everything in my power to ensure that we honor our commitments to our strong ally Israel, and that every action we take is designed to make Israel safer, more secure, and more prosperous. AIPAC, thank you for everything you do. Let us work together to do everything we can do to make sure that next year the threats of to Israel have decreased and the stories of Israel's success continue to increase. Thank you, and have a great rest of your convention.